Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about the Land of the Lost. But before we get into that, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell for notifications, and leave us a comment. We've got a great community here, and it's all thanks to you guys. Thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. The prologue to this one takes place in 1974 when Marshall, Will, and Holly were on a routine expedition when they encountered the greatest earthquake ever known. They were high on the rapids when it struck their tiny craft, and they plunged 1,000 feet down a waterfall and through a time portal into the land of the lost. Which brings us to the main plot. One day, the Marshall family are swimming when Rick Marshall's son, Will, finds a passageway into a cavern. So they put their stuff in plastic bags to keep them dry, and they swim through the underwater passageway and into the cold, dark cavern, where they dry off and change clothes, then light a torch and start exploring the cave system. Suddenly, Holly screams, getting the attention of Rick and Will. Here in the cave are several reptilian Sleestaks. The Marshall family waits a moment, but the Sleestaks don't move. So Rick tells his kids they must be in some sort of hibernation. Upon closer inspection, the Marshalls can see the Sleestaks are covered in spiderwebs, so they've been here for a while. So Rick and Holly leave the chamber, but as they do, one of the Sleestaks wakes up, cutting off Will's exit. So he runs down a different tunnel as the other Sleestaks slowly wake up and follow him like zombies. Rick calls out for Will, but when Will doesn't answer, Rick says he's going back for him. He tells Holly to go on without him, but she argues. And as they do this, more Sleestaks hear them and move in on their position. So now Rick and Holly split up too. So now each member of the Marshall family is running through a different tunnel, and each one is being followed by Sleestaks, who open their mouths, showing off their multiple rows of teeth. Holly gets to the water where they came in and dives in, and she swims through the underwater passageway and comes out through a hole in the bottom of the area where they were originally swimming. And when she gets out there are plant-eating dinosaurs here, drinking the water and eating some nearby ferns. Meanwhile, Rick Marshall seems to have lost his pursuers, but now he's lost in the tunnels. So he picks up a stone and starts making chalk-like markings on the tunnel walls to try to help him navigate. And as he's doing that, his son Will turns a corner and encounters some more Sleestaks. So Will goes through a doorway-like section of cavern, and for some reason, the Sleestaks can't follow him. Here in this new room, he encounters a being who looks like a Sleestak, but he's tan instead of green, and he's wearing a weird metallic orange tunic. His name is Enoch, and he's unable to leave. Enoch then takes Will to a nearby table-like device to show him why he can't leave. Meanwhile, when Rick and Will don't come out of the watering hole, Holly dives back in to go rescue them. And as she swims through the underwater passageway, Rick is still lost in the tunnels. He circles around and finds his own marking on the wall. Frustrated, he tries to get his bearings and figure out which way to go. Holly gets out of the water in the cold dirt cavern and now has no dry clothing and a plastic bag to put on this time. So she shivers in the cavern and starts searching for her father and her brother. As she does that, Enoch explains to Will that he has tried to use a time doorway to leave the land of the lost, but something is keeping him from leaving what he refers to as the staging area. Enoch says it is as if the law of temporal momentum has been violated, which Will doesn't understand at all. Enoch says he is sorry that Will doesn't understand dimensional mechanics and says that it's actually quite simple. Enoch suggests that nothing can leave the land of the lost unless an identical object of equal mass enters it. Will says, so you mean for my family to leave, 3 other people have to take our place? Enoch says that that is close to being correct, but it still isn't quite it. He says that the Marshall family does not belong here at all to begin with, and he thinks their presence here is what is preventing Enoch from leaving. Will is still confused. So Enoch activates a viewing device and shows Will what seems to be the past. Will watches the scene unfold on Earth as his family goes whitewater rafting together. The earthquake happens and they go over the waterfall. But this time, there's no time warp. Will is shocked by the sight of his family hitting the rocks 1,000 feet below. Will asks where the time warp was, and Enoch says he does not know. Will is trying to come to terms with the fact that he just watched himself die. And Enoch repeats that he should not be here now. So Will says, how can that be? The time viewer then shows what seems to be a time loop. Once again, the screams of Holly can be heard, and the Marshall family, the other Marshall family, plunge to the rocks below the waterfall. Enoch says that for some reason, the Marshall's presence in the land of the lost is causing time to break down, and that they must somehow be removed. Meanwhile, Holly continues to search for her family, and in doing so, she runs into her dad. She asks where Will is, and he says he doesn't know. Just then, a Sleestak grabs Rick, and he's forced to fight it. As they search for Will, Enoch is trying to explain a time paradox to the boy, who in turn is beginning to question whether or not he and his family have actually died and just don't know it yet. And maybe the land of the lost is like purgatory or something. After defeating the Sleestak in the corridor, Holly and Rick finally find Enoch's chamber, and Enoch has them enter. And as soon as they walk in, they see that viewer displaying what Will has been watching. So Holly hears herself scream, and she says, it's us. That day we fell through the time doorway. But Will tells her they never fell through the time door. Holly says, of course we did. It's why we're here. So Enoch again tries to explain what's going on, and Rick doesn't get it either. So Enoch becomes frustrated. He tries to explain what a time paradox is, but it doesn't seem to do very much good. Enoch says, you are here, but you are also there. Rick Marshall asks if they could throw a rope through this viewing device, and Enoch explains that wouldn't work. Enoch says if he can keep them from being brought here in the first place, it may repair the damage to the time-space continuum. Holly says, then we'd be killed on the rocks. Enoch says you have a fine grasp of the obvious. Rick says their demise is not an option, and there must be another way. Enoch talks again about the idea that nothing can leave the land of the lost unless an identical object of equal mass enters it. So Rick asks why it can't be the Marshalls on the viewer. Enoch says he can't do that because it goes against the rules that his race lives by. So Rick Marshall uses the device to open a portal. The Marshalls they had been watching enter the portal. And the Marshalls who'd been with Enoch leave through a second portal in the cavern. Which brings us to the epilogue. Or is it the prologue? The Marshall family arrives in the land of the lost, where they encounter a T-Rex named Grumpy, who chases them into a cave where the previous Marshall family had been living. So everything they need to survive is already here. The right number of beds, berries that had been gathered, and they have no idea who lived here before them or what happened to them. Seeing that these berries were safe to eat, the Marshalls go out and find more berries that look like these. And for the first time, the Marshall family encounters the Sleestaks. But that's a story for another day. This adventure was based on the final episode of Land of the Lost Season 1, which aired in 1974. I caught it in reruns as a kid, and honestly, I never quit thinking about it. I misremembered it, though, where I thought when they left, they did it on a raft. So imagine they filmed this on a big sound stage with a river running through the middle. In my mind, when they left the soundstage downstream, they basically got their memory wiped, then entered the soundstage upstream. Sort of like the old 8-bit Zelda, where you'd be in the Lost Woods, and if you walked off the map to the right, you would just re-enter the exact same map, but from the left. Or Pac-Man. The Pac-Man maze kind of works like that too. So in my mind, the Marshall family were in this loop that they could never escape. And that thought haunted me for years. So it's nice to grow up and get that it's a causality story instead. So yes, the reason they were swallowed up by a time warp was because their older selves worked the controls and they were the ones who opened it. And yes, they got to go home, as I understand it. And that whole concept, whether I grasped it correctly or not, made me a fan. So when they made a new Land of the Lost show in 1991, I watched that one too. It's on YouTube, by the way, but it hasn't aged very well, in my humble opinion. Interestingly enough, in the 1991 version, a different family enters, where again, it's a father, a son, and a daughter. In the original script, they were going to meet a jungle girl who was supposed to be Holly. And she was going to have Chaka the man ape with her too. And I don't know if it's because Sid and Marty Krofft wanted her to have made it home or what, but Holly was renamed to Krista and Chaka was renamed Stink. And even Grumpy the T-Rex was renamed Scarface, which I think is kind of a bummer. I would have liked to have seen some characters return to tie the two together more than it did. Then, of course, there was the Will Ferrell version of Land of the Lost, which most people hated, but I enjoy parts of it. I did not like that Rick, Will, and Holly were no longer related. And then it becomes super awkward when they try to shoehorn a love story into it. I myself am a firm believer that not everything has to have a love story in it. But what I liked about the film was that they hinted that when a name brand is discontinued, it is actually shunted into the Land of the Lost. And this will sound stupid, but it actually reminded me of a Ren and Stimpy episode where they did something very similar. In that one, they hint that when you put two socks in your dryer, but only one comes out, that the other sock was transported to their version of Land of the Lost. So, like that, the Will Ferrell film would be a place where you could find things like old toy stores from your youth that no longer exist, like, say, Children's Palace or Lionel Kitty City, that sort of thing. And that movie came out in 2009. And in 2010, the seventh edition of a role playing game called Gamma World was released, which I felt like the two are very similar. So we used the Gamma World rules to run a Land of the Lost role playing game. One of the big threats in the game were a race of zombies where they infect you simply by touching you and spreading russet mold spores. And so characters didn't just have to avoid the zombies themselves, but you had to be worried about touching anything that they might have touched and left spores on. And in that game, we brought in a race of intelligent dinosaurs who were from a timeline where the dinosaurs were never wiped out. And my son played an intelligent talking velociraptor for quite a while until his uncle Scott got him killed. So then after he died, we let my son play the dinosaur's ghost, which I thought was cool because I'd never seen that done before. And we didn't stop there. Over the years, we ran a ton of Land of the Lost games. We had a D&D party who wound up in the Land of the Lost at one point, and I decided our local Dead Mall was in the Land of the Lost. So the D&D guys enter a shopping mall and they think it's like a temple or something. And to be clear, I didn't tell the players they were in a mall, right? I described the whole thing using D&D speak. So I remember them walking in and finding benches and thinking that these were altars for sacrifices, and they were like really worried why this place would have so many sacrifices simultaneously, and so they thought it was like a temple of death or something. Likewise, mall trash cans confused them, so they started to set the trash inside on fire, thinking these were some sort of weird torches or whatever that were supposed to light the mall. I had a tribe of were-rats living in the old Sears end of the mall, which admittedly was just a mall rats joke. And one of the were-rats was a tinkerer who was using the stuff in Sears to make various traps. And I remember the escalator had been modified and was particularly lethal now. If I recall correctly, it could go flat like a ramp and the characters would slide down it into combine like blades at the bottom that were spinning. Teaching them to fear and respect that escalator was also a Mallrats joke, by the way. And the Land of the Lost is always there for players to explore. At one point, we had a group of superheroes in the 1990s who went there. Jason Seidner played the Invincible Kid, and he wound up in that Sears where he picked up a camcorder, hit record, and then threw it like a football into the face of an enemy. He rolled like a massive critical success. And he kept that VCR tape, and the team made it back to the Earth K dimension again. And that VCR tape was in their headquarters for years. And Howard Warnes played a character named Polar, who was based on Glacius from Killer Instinct. And Polar stopped fighting crime because he decided he would rather just sit on the team's couch and watch that tape over and over again. And the leader of that team was a kid named Matrix, whose dad had been to the Land of the Lost. His dad went there when he was a teenager, and while he was there, he met a character named Alaric, who was short and fat like a dwarf. Al had green skin, orange hair, and three fingers on each hand. And he dressed kind of like a hippie, where he had like a tie-dye shirt and stuff like that. and he could fix anything. Another character from that campaign was Chode, who was this weird cross between a pink turtle and a beholder. He had like 6 little tan colored tendrils that he could walk around on, and then he had one eye stalk where his head should be. Carissa was in that group. She was based on the cover art that Olivia did for Heavy Metal Magazine in October of 1985. So she was like a zebra lady. Mary Jane was our Poison Ivy knockoff. Max was more or less a knockoff of Soundwave from Transformers. Spot was this flying droid that looked like a chrome eyeball with arms. Tia was a knockoff of Tinkerbell, and when they'd go to places like that mall that I mentioned, she was like the right size where she could wear Barbie doll clothing. And then there was Zarya, who was a half dragon slash half human, who was the daughter of the main bad guy. And the main bad guy was this huge green colored dragon named Zaxxas, who was a cyborg. And he wound up taking control of the Sleestak army, as well as a bunch of other reptilian races. And something we did was when the heroes showed up, Zaxxas is old and he already hates him. The party also meets an old man named Crotes, who is a magic user, and he seems to know everything about him too. Then at one point, they use a crystal pyramid, and the party leader, who's the father of Matrix, goes back in time to when Crotes and Zaxxas were young. So he tries to take out Zaxxas before Zaxxas can become a problem. And then the injuries that Zaxxas gets in that fight are why he was a cyborg when they first encountered him in the future. And Matrix's dad, traveling with young Crotes, telling him about the party, is how old man Crotes knew what he did in the future. So they all eventually escape from the land of the lost and they get back to Earth, where various bad guys try to reproduce those crystal pyramids through technological means. And that's where the Black Pyramid came from in our game. And the Black Pyramid was the whole reason we did time travel stuff recently, which is how the Red King wound up with the Infinity Gems. So in our game world, the Land of the Lost is actually pretty important. And the thing that started all of that for me was watching that episode as a kid where the Marshall family leave the Land of the Lost only to arrive in the Land of the Lost. Anyways, we think the Land of the Lost concept is interesting. Hopefully you thought this was interesting too. If so, as always, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell for notifications, and leave us a comment. From all of us here at the longest running superhero RPG on Earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.